Hello and welcome to MySecTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and welcome to our Tuesday afternoon episode. And today we're going to do quarter two of 2021, a space sector update with Dr. Chris Flaherty, and he is with the MySpace Warfare Analysis Lab. We had the last one at the end of March for quarter one. So we're going to be looking at what space activity has been occurring, and there is a lot going on across, particularly in the UK. We're going to be looking at today here in Australia and also in the US. We might touch on some other nations as well, and as we sort of undergo a space race. Let me just walk through the socials and also what we've been up to. And if you are listening and you have tuned in or you're about to tune in for the longer session, welcome to let us know where you're listening from. And also please say good day. And also, given that we're in space and we're focused on space today, you are more than welcome to make comment or ask a particular question from Chris as well. We cover off on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We should be streaming on YouTube, LinkedIn and Facebook. Our main Facebook page is the Asia Pacific Security Magazine. And we probably will go for at least 45 to 60 minutes today with Chris. So thank you very much for his time, and he's also writing for us on a continual basis on our spaceanddefence.io channel. Just following on from last week, we met with the Australian National University and the University of South Australia for a couple of interviews. First one was the night vision being revolutionised out of ANU. Professor Dragomir Nejev, who is with the Transformative Meta-Optical Systems, or TMOS, one of the Australian Research Council Centres of Excellence. Very interesting in terms of the night vision film that they are developing. And then also we crossed to Adelaide with Dr. James Walsh with the Australian Research Centre also for interactive and virtual environments. And they are telling a complex tale. They've developed a automatic narrative visualisation tool which is being applied for crime fighters. But this has applications in sort of large case and data sets, whether it's cybersecurity, crisis management, logistics, manufacturing. So very, very interesting. And I think you're going to hear a lot more from that one as well. Just to catch up from last week, we were with SIDEF in Canada and our Indian partners, the Aerospace and Defence Consultants Association of India, looking at ransomware attacks. And we also concluded our episode 4 with Davcore, Eva and 6Clicks and our Security Consultant Insight series. And we also had an update from the Australian Security Industry Association CEO, Brian De Carey's. And unfortunately, the Security Expo here in Sydney, which was due for next month, has now been postponed to November. And likewise with the ASIAL conference. So stay tuned for that one. And we're about to drop a new podcast from Jane Lowe in Singapore with ESET, but otherwise her recent interviews with Microsoft and there in Germany with the Hasso-Plattner Institute is available on Malware. We're also finalising our Cyber Risk Leaders issue, number 5, but also we're going to bring back the Australian Cybersecurity Magazine. And thanks, Owen, from Newman, WA, mate. Beautiful. I was actually born in Newman, so it's good to have someone in the Pilbara. That's out in the middle of nowhere. So you're locked down anyway, but good to have you with us, Owen. And our sponsors this week, IT Glue, Secure ID and RSA Business, also ALC and their certified courses in cybersecurity. I'm going to have to take this one down, unfortunately, but the last shout for Elevated Intelligence, those dates should now be the 17th to the 19th of November. If you want to support the channel, check out our MySecTV.shop and our Cyber War series. But otherwise, that is it from me on the MySecurity Marketplace. And let's get a market space sector update from Dr. Chris Flaherty. Chris, thanks for joining us again, mate.
Thanks, Chris. And I very much like the celestial music that we introduced this segment with.
Oh, celestial. Okay, I'll take that. Now, you've done quite an extensive piece of work on this particular update. We've got some slides to share, but yep. I think maybe a catch-up, sort of the highlights for the last quarter for you that might be sticking out. And then you'd let us know in terms of how you want to run through the document. And we'll make this available for the audience as well. And we'll put this on our Space and Defence channel.
Yep, I think when we last finished off, SpaceX was still yet to launch. It had finally a successful launch of the ascent of the prototypes starships, and it perfected its landing technique. And they're now pushing along towards a super heavy launch, or a combined super heavy launch with their booster as well as their starship. There's still some issues of controversy associated with that, particularly about the safety and sound profile. But we'll wait and see how that will develop. The other major space event, of course, is the Chinese have successfully manned their space station, which is now growing in size. It's a great piece of engineering. It really is. It's just really interesting to watch that grow. There's been controversy, of course, with the way in which there's been return of boosters and so forth. These are issues which are pressing across the world about what we do about the increasing burden of space debris orbiting our planet. This is a major environmental issue, and this needs to be thought about in these sorts of terms. Interestingly enough, we'll be looking at a couple of companies from the UK, or one in particular, our Sea Launch, which is very much focused on net impact, if you like. The other major, of course, was that Integrity flew several times and continues to fly well beyond expectations. And that's given line to an entirely new concept in terms of aeronautic engineering. Given the fact they're also now thinking of other places other bodies within our solar system, which have heavier atmospheres, of which we can start using aeronautical probes. So one of the interesting things is from now on, when you ask an aeronautical engineer to design me a craft, they'll say, well, which planet do you want it on?
Fair enough.
Because we now have ballooning on Venus, we have flying on, helicopters on Mars, and we're about to have a helicopter on one of the Jovian satellite moons. So this is a really interesting time.
Well, look, and this is why we're going to do this every quarter, because there is so much going on. We have had the likes of Southern Launch, Rocket Lab, the Space Centre out of Adelaide, also on our channels over the months, and we will continue to do so. And SpaceX should be launching within the next sort of 24 hours, literally today, 29th of June. They're putting with some 88 onboard satellites that they're about to launch. So really day by day, a lot is happening. And you mentioned China and a lot of the other nations. So there's a bit of a space race on. Now, maybe let's walk through your sort of highlights and what areas you want to cover. Likewise, from the audience, if there's any particular areas you want to have covered, we'll get Chris's comment on. You mentioned the way that China sort of launched their ISS and some of the debris, but also we've also got plans for a new ISS up there as well to replace the existing one. Where was that maybe at the moment? Where do you see that developing?
Yep. The situation with the ISS is it is actually hitting its end of life process. Now, whether that takes 5 years or more, depending on how they actually manage that. What we're also seeing is that there's two other proposals out. They're not actually proposals. They will, in fact, they will happen. Axiom space station will be constructed. It's going to be constructed off the ISS using that as its basic backbone, and then it'll be released. Sierra Nevada Corporation is also preparing to build its own space station to be serviced by the Dream Chaser, which we'll talk about in the context of the UK spaceports. So essentially, we're looking at potentially several space stations operating in Earth orbit. The other, of course, potential is a space station, which will be the Lunar Gateway, respectively a space station for the Moon. And if you look at a lot of the literature and a lot of the sort of commentary at the moment about how the next mission to Mars, or human mission to Mars, will take place, increasingly the methodology is thinking in terms of there has to be either some sort of station installation on one of Mars's moons, or alternatively a station in orbit. Because again, it goes back to the ability. It's not a question anymore of fly me to the moon. It's the ability to build a sustainable infrastructure around a planet or a planetary body, or the moon if it is a planetary body like the moon, in order to sustain the sort of operations we have on ground. This is tied up as well as no longer are we sort of thinking in terms of we will go to a place and then come back and that becomes a celebration in its own right. It's about going there to permanently launch operations from the surface of the moon or on Mars. or on any of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The real issue at the moment is there is a fundamental shift occurring. I mean, this is a really interesting time because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think we should talk about this just briefly. All the dates to do with the major innovations and change in space in terms of even the defense sector setting up space forces, all dated around 2020. And it's really interesting that the world has been completely embroiled in this pandemic. There are these fundamental technology shifts occurring in terms of a major flip occurring between space technology exploration, which was largely in the preserve of government and defense, flipping dramatically and massively over into private corporations. The other thing, of course, being is that we are in our 60th or 70th year of space exploration and space technology. I believe I watched the first landing on the moon of man walking on the moon. I think I did. I'm not really sure because I remember being, as a very young child, being shunted into a classroom, told to look at a black and white TV, and was never explained why. But I do remember a lot of the paraphernalia, such as the little medallions of the Apollo 11 and so forth. So I probably did watch it. I'm not sure.
But it's certainly what I think you're making the point. It's in your lifetime.
In our lifetime, we watched this happen, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I'm getting out of here, and we might start with your next slide, is the amount of interest now in the launch locations from Earth and getting that, because that sounds like that's going to be quite a competitive area, or maybe not so much competitive, but certainly it will make space exploration and the use of space in our general travel also. And that's something we've heard from Rocket Lab as well. They want space planes where you will catch a space plane as common as what you would have a normal plane pre-pandemic, maybe.
Perhaps that might in fact happen. I think let's look at this broadly historically. If we take 1980s as a typical date or point in time, the notion of launching a satellite, these were large, heavy satellites that went largely into geostationary orbit. They're mainly to do with telecommunications, TV, and other applications like that. These are satellites being launched largely from the equatorial region. This is where we see the big, dominant Cape Canaverals and other major space launch facilities. The situation that's actually happening now in our decade or in our year, 2020, 2021, is a fundamental shift towards the idea of small rockets, small payloads, with a series of classes of satellites that begin with a small microsatellite in around the 400 to 500 kilogram range, descending in order down to microsatellites and then nanosatellites. And now everyone, no doubt, has been hearing about the CubeSat, which is the 10 by 10 by 10 cube. Microtization of technology, our capacity to build these things and the capability we can cram into these increasingly smaller objects is dramatically changing the notion of launch. In a sense, we're looking at small. We're not looking, even though the market at the moment is being dominated by the Titanic space, Starship, which is 100 tons effectively launch capacity. We're no longer talking about pounds per launch. We're talking about tons per launch. At the other end of the market, is this growing issue about small launch. These small launches into low Earth orbit and suborbital can occur pretty well anywhere on the planet, because you're looking for a particular orbit you want to go into. And this is actually meaning that today's talk is largely going to be centered about rockets. It's about spaceports, and spaceports being merged or growing out of airports. And so today's talk is really looking at what's actually developing in the UK, which is really exciting. In terms of the UK has effectively, it's called the Launch UK program. And it's looking at the UK having identified already several sites across the country, which are potentially going to see either vertical launch or horizontal launch. Now, horizontal launch is probably the most interesting. I mean, I think anyone who's interested in space technology, space exploration, will know about Pegasus. It's a commercial size plane which launches a rocket from its underbelly. No doubt people have seen Virgin Orbit and Virgin Galactic. Virgin Orbit is horizontal launch, as is Virgin Galactic. Both of which involve air launch capability. And later on in this talk, we'll talk about sea launch as well, because there's been several examples. And there's a brand new company coming out of the UK called Black Arrow Space Black Arrow So, as I said, the market itself, and now we go to the map of the UK. The UK is really best understood as a series of what you call the northern cluster, and then you're talking about the southwestern coastline of the United Kingdom, starting in Scotland and progressively moving down. Now, the UK, the interesting thing about this is that even though we're looking potentially at 7 sites, it's not the case that anyone thinks that all 7 sites may ultimately be operational. Some may prevail, some may not. What is happening in the UK actually has one massive advantage. It's a total outcome of the Cold War period of the NATO years. They've got large military airports, former military airports. They have very long runways and strong runways. They've got airports that point out to sea. They've got airports that actually are in non-populated areas. Essentially, the whole structure underneath this is that launching a rocket really is talking about an infrastructure in terms of how it's not so much the launching of the rocket itself, it's actually how a country is preparing itself to be a licensing authority in terms of getting a rocket into space under international treaty. And the issue paramount is not only economic viability of having a spaceport itself as an outgrowth of an airport, does it actually have a launch operator that can actually fits with that particular airport configuration? And secondly, is actually how is that country structuring its underlying legislative and regulatory system in terms of what it will allow to be launched from that country and how will that be undertaken? And the current preference at the moment, if you look at the northernmost cluster, these are all dedicated largely to vertical launch. What they're trying to get advantage of there is the polar orbit in terms from the UK. If you look at the pink bubbles, all those are largely dedicated towards horizontal launch. And Chris, if you want to come in at any point and just ask questions.
No. Well, my first observation is they're all mainly in Scotland. So, what would be the impact if Scotland separates from the UK as they want to do?
Well, that's a political decision. I mean, look. If it ever ended up being a sort of a Kazakhstan type situation, I'm sure they'll just lease it back to the United Kingdom.
Well, the other question I had here is most of these airports and the like, how much of these are in private hands versus government?
Well, in actual fact, they're actually based under public-private partnerships.
Right.
So, for example, there's an excellent interview on The Angry Astronaut with Newquay Airport, one of the executives of Newquay Airport, and the way in which it's described is that there's the government entity which largely sort of manages, if you like, the airport. The airport itself is a private concern, and then there's the private enterprise. So these are all public-private management, and essentially, I mean, this is the other thing is we go from this transition from predominantly government-owned to government-directed to government support to commercial enterprise. And I think, please.
Well, how many of these are being used, or are these just proposed?
These are proposed sites. Newquay is actually the first site which is on the verge of getting its operating license. And it's expected towards, I think the latest interview I saw, they're thinking in June next year, they'll actually start commercial operations for Virgin Orbit.
Now, how does this link to the UK-Australian bridge, the space bridge as well? Does this provide opportunities for Australia, or where does that fit in terms of if this starts to occur? Is this not going to be competing?
Well, and interestingly enough, let's take an operation like Virgin Launch. We'll compare two examples of mobile launch, because on one level you're talking about fixed launch, vertical launch, or you're talking about mobile. At the moment, most of the times when you look at most of the current legislation, the examples are given are air launched, but you also have sea launch capability as well. And sea launch is actually effectively launching off a converted oil rig. There are two famous examples with SpaceX of two of these, but there's an older company called Sea Launch itself, which was a conglomerate, mostly Russian, and has now ended up mostly in Russian hands. Interestingly enough, in China, they're actually looking at a very similar sort of proposal from a Chinese perspective. In actual fact, the Chinese have actually successfully launched rockets from barges in the Yellow Sea. In the British case, the issue with launching is that having mobility in your capacity to launch gives you, if you like, global strategic economic opportunities. And the other issue is you can take the launch to your customer, which is the most effective thing. So in the case of the economic model, which Nuki would be thinking about, would be its viability in terms of the European market, in terms of being close to European entities that need space launch capability. In terms of Virgin Orbit itself, it's actually looking at several sites around the world, as is, we'll talk about the US. Nuki is also involved in a preliminary commercial relationship with Sierra Nevada Corporation, the Dream Chaser, which we'll cover off shortly. But also in the case of a ship like, or a concern like Black Arrow, that's the Dream Chaser there. The Dream Chasers we'll actually just take a little aside just to talk about the Dream Chaser. It's a fascinating piece of technology. It's basically, as you see by the scale of the individual standing there, it's the smallest version of the space.
It is small, hey, that is pretty cool.
It has a certain amount of tonnage in terms of what it can actually convey. It's been designed primarily to service the space station, both the International Space Station, also the Sierra Nevada Corporation Space Station as well, which will effectively be a space station space factory. Its capability is to largely launch from the continental United States, service dock at the space station, whichever one we're talking about, and then return. Nuki has actually been signed up, as is Glasgow. Glasgow. I think I'll get that right. I'm terribly sorry if I mispronounce some of these.
No, that's okay. Check it, because there's a lot of detail in here.
Glasgow Preswick Airport. Both of them are actually looking at opportunities for the Dream Chaser, particularly Nuki, because the Dream Chaser can effectively land anywhere. The defining limitation, if you like, is the Dream Chaser requires 8,000 feet of runway in order to land. So just think of this. If you can all remember back seeing the space shuttle come down, it largely comes down as a glider. It has its drag parachute. It hits the runway and it gradually slows down. So in the case of the Dream Chaser, it takes about 8,000. Most of the major British runways we're talking about in terms of their prospective spaceports all have runways in around the 9,000 foot mark. Again, they're a carryover from the Cold War period when these were fairly large NATO airports or military bases. Now, conceptually, what we're talking about is that it's not so much, again, we're moving away from this idea of launch as an event in its own right. The launch is actually plugging into something else. And so what's it actually plugging into? Well, it's plugging into the idea of a space-based economy. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does that actually mean? What is a space-based economy? Up to now, we talk about space tourism. That's a big aspect of that, because in actual fact, one of the other major players in this is both Blue Origin with its space tourism module, which is the New Shepard, and of course we've got Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic, which is actually an air launch. The difference being Blue Origin is vertical takeoff; it has to take off from a launch pad. Virgin Galactic is it's an aircraft mothership which carries the actual rocket ship. So again, it's an air launch concept. So either of those can operate easily from any commercial airport. And it goes back to, where's your market? So one of the interesting points is that even though you're asking how could these plug into an Australian context, the question is do you have an airport, like an international airport, which can safely land a 747? Because that's what Cosmic Girl is. She's a converted 747.
Well, they've just spent a lot of money increasing the defence runways as well for the Joint Strike Fighter. So I wonder if that's assisted at all, because there's a number of runways that they've been working on and developing for that program.
Well, it raises a really interesting question, because, for example, for a craft like the Dream Chaser to operate, effectively it's operating and circumnavigating the planet. So if you think about, for example, one of the interesting early features of just looking at it right now, sorry about this, Campbelltown Airport, which is in Scotland as well, its military runway was actually seen as the alternate or the emergency runway for emergency landing of the space shuttle. So, for example, anywhere on the planet which actually has got suitable runways, these are going to be regarded as, potentially, if a Dream Chaser has has an issue, it needs emergency landing capability, emergency landing opportunities. So you could potentially see, for example, a country like Australia fitting into that model. I mean, one of the interesting things about Australia, I think we'll cover off this, Australia actually is in a unique position in relation to the world because of its continental position, but also Australia actually is fundamentally linked up in terms of it's part of that entire network of ground stations that are essential for any mission off world.
Yep.
Hence we go to the famous parks.
Well, we've CSIRO just signed up another agreement for, I think, a Mars mission too. That
and also
involved with that.
Also, Intuitive Machines with the next group of commercial lunar missions.
Correct. Yes, that's with their robotics. Yep.
Yeah. So, and essentially, again, we get back to I suppose if you're asking a more broader question, if you were to build a spaceport, what would you be thinking about? Let's take the UK as an example to start with. In their particular instance, they were mainly looking at airports that actually had very little residential build-up because of the safety issues, as well as the disruption to local populations. They're looking at airports that could have a safety range, preferably water, or flying over, basically taking off and flying over the coastline onto clear water. You're potentially looking at it already is actually in a marriage relationship, if you like, with a commercial operator, which it operates from. And the other thing is that spaceport is part of a global alliance of spaceports. Because at this point in time, you have to start thinking in terms of not only is the spaceport a national capability, but how does it fit into a global system? Because you can actually, if you were to launch a rocket, for example, we take a concept like an Earth-to-Earth rocket transporter. It's an hour transportation in either direction across the planet. So, for example, we're in a planet which is constantly revolving. An object in space goes at 17,000 miles per hour. So the International Space Station takes about 9 or 10 rotations. So at the time that we've actually been talking, which will be about an hour,
just gone around
how much things have spun around this planet on our planet itself, which is rotating. So, and essentially, when you start thinking about your relationship with building a national spaceport, you have to be a country which has actually got that space or that capability. And Australia certainly is one of those. It also has actually is part of that global ground station, global space station or space communication, space monitoring, as well as the fact is that you're dealing with objects which are spinning around this planet. So essentially, the foreseeability of the fact, do we need to, do we set ourselves up? Because at some point we'll have to take a dream chase, we'll have to come to land. But then, of course, you're also talking about advanced technologies. What are we actually talking about when we're talking about a space economy? Well, we're talking about mining in space, potentially, on the asteroid belt. We're also talking about what is it we can produce in microgravity or zero gravity environment, 3D printed organs. Because water holds. If you've ever seen an astronaut hold a droplet of water, it's a perfect sphere. It holds its shape. We're talking about the production of solar units, which are much more advanced than we can produce on Earth. If we produce them on Earth, they're highly toxic to do so. In space, it's a safe environment. What else are we talking about? We're talking about the production of certain types of fiber optics, which are much more efficient. These are high. So when you want to think about this in terms of the drive commercially, which is where you're looking at your SpaceXs, is to try and commercially drive down the cost of a rocket launch to shift that from pounds to tonnage. But at the same time, what you're also asking yourself is that if we're producing a commodity in space, what's the economics of doing that? Is it so valuable that it far exceeds the costs of launching to get the materials into space, to make it in space, and then return it from space? So if you look at the UK business model, interestingly enough, they're envisaging a situation where a dream chaser is taking off from Australia. Sorry, I just got confused there. Off from the United States, servicing a space station, then returning with a product. That product's unloaded from the dream chaser. That then goes to facilities for processing. Now, the next question, of course, being, which is interesting about when you look at the UK commercial model, it actually leads into sea, air, ground, rail transport. ultimately for distribution. So essentially, it performs exactly the same function as any commercial airport in terms of the distribution of goods. It's just coming in from a production system which is circumnavigating the Earth. So that, I think, essentially you're asking the question. Then, of course, we look at it purely from an Australian perspective in terms of, if we were to have a Virgin Galactic or Virgin Orbit or a Sea Launch, coming in, operating on Australian waters or Australian skies. Therefore, that brings in the question about services and support. And I think this is the major thing. Is I think the one level we're focused on the building and the construction of rockets, the building and construction of launch facilities. But what comes out of that is the other industries which begin to actually develop around that in terms of servicing that, as well as actually taking product from that and turning it into other commodities. And of course, then there's space tourism. Space tourism is anticipated to be one of the major growth areas. So it is foreseeable to say, could we see Virgin Galactic space tourism from Sydney Airport? Highly likely. Not improbable.
One of the other things I wanted to raise was New Zealand seems to have the same capabilities because it's an island, has suitable launch locations, as we've covered before with, say, Rocket Lab.
Yeah, that's correct. In actual fact, you need to understand the Australian. When you're talking about the Australian, it's really the Australian, New Zealand, Pacific context, or in terms of our particular regional area. Australian space capabilities currently are highly dependent on New Zealand. I think earlier this year we had the launch of an ANU CubeSat by Rocket Lab from New Zealand. So essentially, until Australia begins to actually develop its own space launch capabilities, and there's about 3 companies we'll be looking at, which is Equatorial Launch, Southern Launch, and also Gilmore Space. Well, that's actually Gilmore Space's tech. Now, I think you've interviewed most of those companies, haven't you, Chris?
We've had Gilmore on as well, and also Southern Launch. I'm sorry about my camera then. I don't know what it just wanted to have a break. So well done, Chris, for keep going. Maybe let's follow on an update on Australia and what you have seen. It's a good segue now. We've mentioned Gilmore, Southern, and a few others. What have been some of your observations? Gilmore's been doing a few interesting things.
Well, yeah, in actual fact, the Gilmore, again, what we're looking at in the Australian situation is actually running very much parallel to the United Kingdom as far as I can see and tell. What we're looking at there is Gilmore that's actually one of its test proof of concept, which they've developed a mobile flatbed launching rig. The actual craft itself, I think they're calling it the AEST, so I'm going to mispronounce this. I'm really sorry. The Dart was the Dart actually was the Australian defence. It was a commercial rocket, but it's quite small. It was actually one of the first commercial launches we saw from Australia in 2020, which was carrying a RAF, it was Royal Australian Air Force package. Gilmore Space, it's called the AERIS. I'm terribly sorry about that, folks.
That's okay. The AERIS orbital rocket, 25 high, 3-stage rocket capable of launching small satellites. Yeah,
that's it, and it's 25 meters high. Again, what we're looking at is this notion, this idea of building a space industry around the small launch, micro launch, nano launch, or nano satellite capability. In essentially, the other thing we've got to think about is, are we talking about satellites? Because most of the commentary that you see says it's launching satellites. I mean, essentially, one of the major business cases being made in the UK is they're looking at 10% of the global market in terms of small satellite launch. For the UK, that would roughly equate to something in the order of about 3,500 satellites being launched by 2035. Comparatively, SpaceX is in the process of launching a mega cluster of 12,000 satellites. So the other interesting thing is, if you look at that statistic about the UK in terms of them cornering a section of the satellite market, only about it comes to about something like, the estimate's about 146 tons, for argument's sake. About 6 tons of that is actually military. The rest is commercial and civil. So you're seeing a huge shift towards commercial civil market rather than actually defense and governmental dominated. But the other thing is we're not just talking about small payload launches of satellites into Earth orbit. We're also talking about space probes. For example, one of the major industries I think which is going to start developing is people going to get seriously interested about finding what is actually on in the asteroid belt. I mean, it's not. I mean, for example, one of the projected ideas is with Virgin Orbit is their capacity to stick a second stage onto the rocket, which is already deployed, which is already coming off Cosmic Girl. That in itself boosting into a mission towards the Mars, taking a probe, or a mission towards Venus, taking a probe. So essentially, we're starting to look at people both in academic as well as commercial interests, such as, for example, sending a probe into the asteroid belt to find out what exactly is there in terms of what's economically exploitable ultimately.
Yeah, in terms of mining, right? Minerals.
We're talking about mining opportunities, particularly water ice in terms of the production of fuel. We're also looking at just in terms of a better understanding. I mean, I think one thing is that, think of it this way, a lot of people ask, well, you know, in terms of science has always traditionally been government or university led. But what happens if you actually say, well, science is also commercially led, but what is it that they're commercializing? They're commercializing the knowledge. So essentially it becomes actually a trade in information, knowledge, concepts, and ideas. So, for example, if you've got commercial missions, probes being sent to the asteroid belt, they're collecting data or information everyone is going to be interested in about what they.
And they will buy that data.
Well, yeah, and essentially, you know, I know that sounds unpalatable because we always talk about free opportunity, also free access to information and data. We also have to accept that there is such, you know, this idea that information becomes a tradable commodity in its own right. Yeah. And essentially, you know, it's not a big concept to wrap your head around, because we are now primarily an information knowledge-based culture and society. I mean, you know, if you want to take a real aside, a real left view, since the recent UFO reports come out of the Pentagon, you know, one of Carl Sagan's original propositions, this is the reason why the Golden Record was sent on Voyager, was that he anticipated extraterrestrial civilizations, if they existed, would be primarily trading information about each other. That would be the major galactic commodity.
Well, we have market. It's a bit like this, Chris, in terms of market updates and market research. Exactly. You're doing all the hard work.
So, you know, the Golden Record was sent out there primarily with information about us. In actual fact, Carl Sagan's original thinking was that why we're doing it is because he envisaged in his imagination that a spacefaring civilizations would be so old, but they'd be interested primarily. They don't have a lot of contact to each other because the difficulties of traveling from one galaxy to the next, or solar system to the next. So they actually trade, but they are able to trade information with each other.
Well, look, just
commoditization is right. So all we have to do is now wait for the alien golden record to come back to us.
Well, not from what I saw on that UFO report. There's not much there. Maybe let's finish off on New Zealand in terms of your notes. University of New South Wales, Canberra's Space M2 CubeSat satellite.
Yeah, we covered that. That's more or less we covered that actually last time because it had launched. But again, it goes back to, I think it reinforces the idea that at the moment, the growing market in Australia, and it's useful to look at the UK by analogy because it's a more mature market. But it does actually show that, because Australia is so similar to the United Kingdom in terms of its history and so forth, and its technology and so forth, and its economics. We're almost looking at very much parallel development in Australia when you compare that to the United Kingdom, in terms of being a country which is primarily looking at small satellite launch, primarily developing rocketry in the small payload category, primarily building spaceport airports, which have the capacity to take on, you know, air horizontal launch capability. We are looking at Australia, I think at Abbott's Point in Queensland, the start of building a vertical launch facility, as we are looking in South Australia and the Eyre Peninsula, as well as the traditional Woomera Range, or ranges, you know, it's clustered around the traditional Woomera area. So essentially, you're thinking in terms of, and then you're looking at that capability for transfer in terms of technology transfer between the two countries, in terms of opening trade opportunities and trade relationships. And the final thing, of course, being is traditionally the British were actually quite dependent on Australia in terms of their ability to launch a satellite or launch because they were heavily dependent in the 60s and 70s. In fact, Black Arrow Technologies is born out of that historical tradition of Britain developing its rocketry here in Australia for launch. Interestingly enough, when Newquay becomes operational next year, we're the first time a commercial satellite has actually been launched from the United Kingdom, and over there will be a horizontal launch using Virgin Orbital. So essentially what we're looking at is a lot of, I think potentially in the long term, it could be two economic opportunities for two countries. And the second point being is that not only is Newquay well situated in terms of it's near one of Britain's major deep space communication centres, that parallels in terms of their side of the planet or their hemisphere. What we have in Australia, of course, is our deep space communication centres as well, capability. And in realities are, if you even look at the American mission, which is the commercial mission, which is intuitive machines going to the moon, part of the commercial setup was they had to have the capacity to bring in continuous global communications, which means that you bring in Australian facilities as well as other facilities across the planet. Because again, we have to think in terms of, we're a spinning ball.
Yeah. Well, we already have we did interview. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. We did interview Defentex, which is researchers out of RMIT, University of Sydney, and the University out of Bundeswehr in Germany. So we do have Australian and European collaboration underway already, and we have covered that. And we mentioned rockets and propulsion. The next one I wanted to cover before we finish off is this particular one on nuclear fission rocket engines. Maybe talk us through this one.
Yeah. Essentially, we're sort of like shifting up a bit of a gear because we've been talking about conventional rocketry and we've been talking about, spaceports and the economics underpinning that. But the interesting thing is that Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom is a major player in the nuclear industry.
Yeah.
And they've signed the major innovation contract to produce a nuclear propulsion engine. What we've put up there is just a very simplified model of how to give people an understanding of how a nuclear propulsion rocket engine actually works. Why are we pursuing this technology? Well, it's been around for a very long time. It's not an entirely new concept. Because of the notes we talk about, basically back in the 60s, the United States had already built these. The major problem always had been is the placing of potentially a nuclear reactor, of launching a nuclear reactor off the planet and placing a nuclear reactor in space. I mean, that was an early problem in terms of the whole global regime, or set up in 67, also the Test Ban Treaty and the earlier Test Ban Treaty in space. I forgot my dates right. Why are we pursuing this? Because at the moment, to go to Mars we're looking at fairly long trips. If we use a nuclear propulsion engine, we have a much shorter trip. It can be as low as potentially 90 days in some cases for a trip to Mars. One of the interesting things is Elon Musk himself a couple of years ago actually posited that he could envisage the Starship actually fitted with a nuclear propulsion engine. As well as its conventional sort of chemical engines in terms of its ultimate landing on the planet or wherever. So essentially, this sounds a bit science fiction-y, but that's
the whole point, isn't it?
This is a fundamental. This is a technology which exists. We know, and it's a question of actually building one. There have been test versions of these built in the last last few decades. But potentially, this actually fundamentally changes our ability for solar system exploration and going to places which at the moment are looking prohibitive in terms of, a manned mission to Mars is problematic in terms of ultimately, having astronauts coping with the transit to Mars and the return. So essentially, this is about dramatically shortening that trip. And this is essential in terms of ultimate exploration.
Well,
we come to something which looks straight out of Thunderbirds.
And talk us through. This is the Skylon configuration by the Reaction Engines Limited, another UK company.
Yep. Again, this is it looks straight out of science fiction. Most industry analysts think the engine itself is a proven concept. What's fascinating about this is it's this idea of, up to now, let's take the Dream Chaser. The Dream Chaser is essentially mounted on the top of a conventional rocket and is launched into space. It goes into orbit, has an engine, to take it, a booster, a small, an engine to take it somewhere. It then comes back, deorbits, and like the space shuttle, basically flies down like a conventional glider. What we're looking at here is this concept which has been almost central to, but not only science fiction as well as conventional science, is the idea of building a spacecraft or a plane spacecraft that can launch from a conventional airport, work like a jet plane, ultimately make the transition to space, becoming a rocket, and docking with a space station or carrying out a mission in space, then deorbiting and returning back and landing back on its runway. So basically, it's a single what's graphological called a single stage launch concept plane. So this is if you like, the next level on, the next generation on in terms of the space.
It's a bit like the space plane out of New Zealand we mentioned, yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, there's these concepts have been around for quite a while. They have dominated science fiction, or science fiction, But the realities is that this particular engine configuration, or particular engine design, most industry pundits, I do encourage people to look at this and have a look at the technology and have a look at and try and understand it, because this potentially could have fundamental implications in terms of the amount of tonnage we can rapidly get into space. See, one of the essential issues is that we're moving towards a situation where, up to now, when we thought about space exploration, it's, you look at something like a Saturn V, it's an enormously large rocket, in order to get actually quite a small amount of payload into space. It's just the tyranny, if you like, of escaping Earth's gravity. Now we're looking at, Elon Musk is looking at fundamentally changing the entire economic equation of space in terms of space exploration and space economy, which is basically moving towards cheaply moving not pounds into space, but tons into space. And we're talking about multi-tons into space, hence the creation of Starship. This is again is again driving that same direction as building a craft which has the capacity to pretty well launch from anywhere, take multi-tons into space, operate like a spacecraft, and then return like an aircraft, and having uniquely an engine which actually performs both. I think in the notes we also talk about another type of Virgin May, in fact, is pursuing another technology opportunity with another United States company, which is solar electric propulsion. And this also fits in with the idea of the nuclear tug. If you like, think of space rocketry, or the way we're now starting to think about space, about the whole idea of how do humans get off the surface of the planet and go into space, and then how do they operate in space. It's a bit like, the old-fashioned babushka, the Russian dolls. Each one is a small. Think of each one of those babushka, each one that you as it opens up and reveals the next one. Each one's got a different type of rocket engine. So think of for example, let's take theoretically, just for argument's sake, as a Starship. It gets launched by a conventional chemical rocket booster into orbit. It then attaches to a nuclear propulsion space tug, which then pushes it, as fast as possible to Mars. It detaches from that. It then uses its chemical rockets, and it's been refueled perhaps at a way station along the way on one of the Martian moons. And then goes into deorbit and lands on Mars with its full chemical rockets. And essentially, what you're looking at is this notion, or with Virgin Orbit, the concept is an aircraft is a type of reusable rocket, or a reusable first stage. It launches to 30,000 feet, drops the rocket takes off, chemical propulsion rocket, gets into Earth orbit. It then releases its second stage. But that second stage is a solar electric engine. So you're dealing with different types of propulsion to get from A to B.
I like it. And I think, as you point out, on an ongoing basis, this technology is known and it's available. It's just a matter of making it happen.
It's implementation.
Well, look, what we'll do, we'll put the show notes on. We also had Kleos. We mentioned SpaceX is waiting to launch up to 88 spacecraft to orbit. It has been delayed for a few days, so we'll find out maybe about 7 o'clock or thereabouts Eastern Standard Australian time. Cleos is there. We've also had Cleos on. We had an interview with Andy Bauer, their CEO, and I've got some shares in Cleos, so hopefully they have a successful launch on the SpaceX Transporter 2 and that particular mission. So if you sort of want something to watch tonight, get onto YouTube, and that SpaceX launch will be telecast. So look, that's it from us. I think Chris will post this session on to spaceanddefence.io. The last one, I think we covered off on the Skylon, and yeah, we've pretty much covered off all of your particular briefing notes today. And thank you very much. What's maybe some of the highlights to look out for other than tonight, or hopefully tonight's launch? Anything else coming up in the next quarter?
Well, I think the other thing that would probably dominate the quarter, we were thinking, or there's been planning in MySecTV for a conferences or some sort of more live event.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you reminded me. I forgot.
We were going to go to the top of the hour, so you got 10 minutes. You got 9 minutes to sell us on the site.
Well, look, we are. We're going to put a seminar and a one-day conference together here in Sydney. That's the idea. Everything's been sort of thrown into turmoil at the moment in terms of planning. We're in a couple of week lockdown, but certainly late September, early October. And so, if you're interested in that particular domain, even if you want to give a presentation, if you're researching in this field, please reach out. But Chris is assisting us with the program, and we'll be reaching out to the industry for a particular focus. One of those is the UK-Australian bridge, but I think there's enough there, particularly from, say, New Zealand, and we've already had a range of people in the industry on MySecTV, so we'll be speaking to them as well. We do have a space and defence playlist on MySecTV on our YouTube channel, so all of these interviews are there and built up over time. Thank you, Chris. Go.
I just will add in, but even though what we're envisaging is we're actually more focused on the actual civil space market.
Correct.
I mean, the realities is that because of this massive change taking in terms of civil capability, these all have defence implications, and that's not denied. But really, the focus is actually now talking about a true space economy thinking in terms of what's available and how this technology is ultimately going to start impacting our lives, and how we actually start making use of this technology to, heaven forbid, turn a buck, to use an Australian expression or American expression. But its fundamental focus is on civil space market, civil space industry.
Well, you mentioned the data, you mentioned the research. I think also the amount of satellites going up in terms of the payloads that they have, you can then start to trade. I mentioned Cleos is a perfect example where they're basically launching satellites and then selling their RF capability to the market, and whether that be defence or law enforcement or others. But effectively, they're using space to commercialize data as a service. And so that's what they're doing. So look, noting on 7 minutes, and thank you for reminding me on that, Chris. Right. We'll continue on our spaceanddefence.io channel. And in terms of that conference, we'll keep you updated. But thank you so much to Dr. Chris Flaherty of My Space Analysis Warfare Lab. And appreciate it.
And we've also got a set of script notes. We didn't strictly keep to these, but I encourage people to have a read of them, because there was a lot of
the link will be out. We'll have this up probably within the next sort of 24 hours, and this will be in the show notes as it goes up onto MySecTV. So, Chris, thank you so much once again. We'll see you back here around September, which is the idea. Okay. All the best. Have a good day. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Great. And just to finish off, as we do, the report of the day, Akamai was in the news recently with a major outage, but they also have their cybersecurity arm and their State of the Internet report. This is volume 7, issue number 3. And let me just increase that so you can actually see some of the figures. And this is gaming in a pandemic, the top web attack vectors in gaming for the 2020. There was a massive increase in terms of the attacks. The SQLI injection and the LFI remain the top 2 types of attack in the gaming industry, mostly due to automated tools and the opportunistic attacks as they play those games. And again, you can see the millions of attacks there, up to near 150 million attacks, representing just under 60% in the SQLI injection. And then the daily web application attacks. And this is kind of seeing a massive uptake on September 28, August 15, and December 16 were also big ones. And I'm not too sure what those correlate to, particularly in the gaming. This one's a big one here on July 11, 2020. But these are attacks in the gaming industry, consistent all year long in 2020, with a massive spike taking place in July. So that one is to check out on the MySecurity Marketplace, the report of the day. And that's it from us. That's a quarterly update for the space sector. And thank you again to Dr. Chris Flaherty. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll be back on Friday morning at 10 o'clock for our Friday morning episode. And we should be looking at tanks and how new tank technology fits into our defence sector. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day.